Good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Goldie, and I am with the AAU project. I'm delighted to welcome you here today to what we're calling our virtual Wheel Bazaar series, or our Wheel Bazaar virtual series, which we are running for 8 weeks in the summer. We'll start with just a little bit of housekeeping here. Please be sure to mute your microphone if you're not speaking. Please use the chat actively. We would really welcome that. We'll be monitoring that. So please put any questions you have as you hear the presentations. Go ahead and put them in there right away so that we can keep track of those. And we'll be using that to ask our panelists questions. And alternatively, you can use the raise hand feature. So you go to reactions at the bottom of your Zoom screen and you click the virtual raise hand, and we'll use that to call on you as well. If you have any problems or challenges with the technology, please just message Tara King, who's here from the AAU as well. And we are also have, I believe, turned on the closed captioning. And so if you want to see the closed captioning as we go along, just click the live transcript icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'd also ask you to change your display name. If you would indicate the name of your institution, just click the participants button or hover over your own photograph and click rename over the little three blue dots. So 2 alternative ways to get there. And if you would just put the name of your institution, that would help us all as we're talking with one another and see the range of institutions represented here today. So let me start by giving a little bit of background on the AAU PhD initiative, and then use that as an opportunity to introduce my colleagues as well. The AAU PhD Education Initiative is a project of the AAU, and let me introduce my colleagues who work at AAU. Emily, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Emily Miller. I'm Deputy Vice President for Institutional Policy, and I work with our member campuses on undergraduate and graduate education, and it's been a delight to collaborate with Chris and others on the PhD Education Initiative. Welcome to the Wheel Bazaar.
Tara?
Hi, everyone. I'm Tara King. I'm the Higher Education Project Manager at AAU, and I'm really glad that you're all able to join us and contribute to the discussion.
Great. So the AAU PhD Education Initiative is a multi-year project where we're initially working with 8 campuses, the 8 pilot campuses as we call them. And then the effort here is to really change the culture around doctoral education so that doctoral education, graduate education is more student-centered and really puts greater emphasis on and focus on the students as individuals with their diverse needs, interests, and challenges. In particular, we're focusing on making the full range of career pathways visible, valued, and viable for all students. And I think I want to pause for a second on that phrase, for all students. Really have a deep commitment to increasing the equity of graduate education and increasing the range of students who have access to PhD education. And I think that's really a theme that's important in today's presentation as well. These slides that we're showing here will be available to you after today's presentation as well. So the focus of the Summer Wheel Bazaar really came out of a convening that we had in February, where there was lots of idea sharing among participants from the 8 member campuses and their member the departments that were really focusing on the work. And there was a lot of interest in interesting things that were happening on various campuses and departments. And people just really wanted to get more information and learn so that they could think about how to adapt and adopt those practices and those initiatives for themselves. And so we thought, well, why reinvent the wheel when you can go wheel shopping? We started saying to ourselves. And so that led us to this notion of a wheel bazaar, where we can, hawk the wheels to one another and help people figure out how to do that on their campuses. So this is the 3rd of our 8-session series every Wednesday for the next couple of weeks. There's more of them to come. And in each week, we focus on one particular theme. So we started with internships and then faculty mentoring. And this week, the focus is on holistic graduate admissions. And usually in the Wheel Bazaar, we feature about 3 presentations from 3 different campuses. This week, because of some amazing work that's been happening at Duke University, we decided to do a deep dive into one kind of wheel, and that's the holistic admissions at Duke University. And I'm very delighted to welcome John Klingensmith, Joel Collier, and Anneli Richter from Duke, and they're going to do our presentation today. And I am just going to be the slide advancer. And the last thing I want to say is, please, let me reiterate, please put your questions into chat, and we will get those at the end. So the format today is that John, Joel, and Anneli are going to speak for about 20 minutes and do their presentation. Then we'll have about 15 minutes for questions from all of you that really will, we want to emphasize the questions that they can sort of answer as a panel. And then we're going to put them into 3 breakout rooms and allow you to pick one of the breakout rooms so that you can ask deeper questions and have a more in-depth conversation with one of the 3 panelists. And then we will end again at the top of the hour. All right, I'm going to kick it off then. I think, John, you're first.
Yes, so thanks. I'm John Klingensmith. I'm the academic dean at Duke Graduate School. But I've also been a director of a graduate program. I've been on several admissions committees. I've had about 15 students where I was their primary PhD dissertation advisor. And through that experience, it's pretty clear to me that the common PhD admissions criteria that are used not just at Duke, but everywhere, things like grades, GRE scores, letters of recommendation, undergraduate or master's institution, research experience, application essay. Each one of these criteria are useful, but none of them individually correlates very well at all with the success that an admitted student will eventually have as they pursue their PhD studies. You know, we can debunk any of these as individual criteria to predict success in graduate school, and that's really not our purpose today, but instead to illustrate some pitfalls and some approaches to get around using these. And in particular, many of you may be aware that over-reliance on maybe just a few criteria really prevents a lot of potentially outstanding students from being admitted. So the most celebrated is the GRE score. You know, I think people are pretty broadly aware now that the GRE, while useful in many ways, is not an even playing field for everybody. Some people have a background that allows them to achieve higher scores on the GRE than others. But we can do the same kind of exercise with any of these criteria. For example, grades are not the same across all universities and colleges. Some places have a lot of grade inflation, some places have none. And so with any one of these things, you can imagine that there are students who are disadvantaged by over-reliance on any particular criterion, as well as students who are overly advantaged. So not only would we potentially not get many outstanding students if we relied on maybe just a couple things for thresholds, unless we have an infinite supply of potentially outstanding students and we can recruit them all, then that's going to be a problem for any graduate program. But it's especially problematic when an important goal for your program is cohort diversity. And that's because, as I mentioned, not all students are going to be able to do equally well in all of these criteria, regardless of the student, him or herself. As I say, it's not a level playing field. So next slide, please, Chris. And an example of a program where diversity is an explicit, important goal is something that we now have at Duke called the Duke University Center for Exemplary Mentoring. This is a program that's supported by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. Duke has one of 9 of these so-called USEMs. And the point of these USEMs, as supported by Sloan, is to increase the recruitment and retention of minority students who are defined as underrepresented US minorities in specified STEM PhD programs. And at Duke, we have about 10 departments and programs that are in our USEM, and they're in the engineering school and in the physical sciences and arts and sciences. So this would be the various engineering departments and also physical science departments like physics, chemistry, math, computer science, so on. And basically what happens in our USEM is that we have about 10 students each year who receive a fellowship that provides them with a supplemental stipend, but also just an amazing variety of additional support, programming, advising, all sorts of things to help them not only get off to a good start through their courses, but be successful all the way to graduation and beyond. And so big questions then are for us, who gets admitted into these departments, as if our goal is to increase the recruitment of underrepresented minority students, then we need to think about who's going to be recruited. And then we also have to think about who is going to be selected for a fellowship among those students who are eligible, who have been recruited to these 10 departments. So this leads us to our next slide, please, Chris. Our approach to that problem, which is to create a rubric for holistic admissions review. And I know you can't see the words here, but you don't need to. We will provide this in the PowerPoint, and also Anneli will be going through some of the details of rubric construction. But the basic concept is that in any program that wants to develop a rubric, such as we did for the Sloan, you need to think of what your evaluative criteria are. And so these are things like research experience, personal statement, recommendation letters, prior education, prior academic performance. Notice for academic performance, we're lumping grades and GRE together. You know, we're sort of purposely de-emphasizing the importance of grades and standardized tests for this particular rubric. But we've also added some additional things, diversity and intellectual fit, which are often beyond the scope of the standard admission criteria. And this is in part because an explicit goal for us is to increase diversity. And it's important to note that we're not defining diversity in any narrow way, such as ethnicity or something like that. We're taking a very broad approach to the definition of diversity. And we've got a little asterisk with a footnote there so that you can see how we're defining diversity. But then also intellectual fit, which is, for example, are there potential advisors who would be a good match for a particular student, regardless of how they look with all these other criteria? Because especially for our programs in engineering, for example, where students really come in planning to work with a particular faculty member, intellectual fit is absolutely key. So the key points are that not only do we have our evaluative criteria, which are shown on the x-axis there, but also we have quantified ratings for the degree of a student's meeting each one of those criteria, ranging from excellent on the left all the way to insufficient on the right. And then those also correspond to a score. So for example, excellence in research experience gets a score of 1, whereas a student who has insufficient research experience would get a 5. And so on for each one of these criteria, so that ultimately we can come up with a numerical ranking for each criteria and an overall score for how a given reviewer would rate each student. And an important point is that in developing this is kind of, if any of you have done NIH grant reviews, this is similar to the kind of rubric and approach that's used in NIH grant review. And I used to do a lot of that, which is why I use this model. But I think it works pretty well because gradations from 1 to 5 are granular enough to really make some distinctions between different applicants, but without being overly granular so that you can't really identify where a student would fit in any one of these excellent to insufficient ratings. And this was developed in consultation with all of our Sloan departments, and so the USEM departments. So we had a lot of faculty who worked with me initially to agree that this would be a rubric that would be useful for us. And then once we've decided that, then we need to have and are having consistent use of the rubric across applications by reviewers. For example, when we're considering who should get our Sloan fellowships in our USEM. And so we all use the same rubric, we're all using the same criteria. A very handy thing about that is that then you can very easily figure out why you gave a student a certain score, which can be very helpful when you're going through a discussion of a lot of candidates. But also the rubric can be adapted for particular PhD programs. And with that, I'll turn it over to Joel Collier because he's a great example in that he's the director of graduate studies for one of our biggest departments, biomedical engineering. So you can talk about how they've adopted a rubric for their use.
Thanks, John. Hi, everybody. I'm Joel Collier. Like Dean Klingensmith just mentioned, I'm a faculty member in our Department of Biomedical Engineering, and I'm currently directing the PhD program there. Also, like John mentioned, we're a large department. We're very multidisciplinary. We span through collaboration and through secondary appointments, quite a bit of campus and various departments, 46 primary faculty, 34 secondary faculty, over 200 current PhD students. We're a large, highly ranked program. And one of the sort of interesting things about the way that we have for decades been doing our recruitment is that it's a direct recruitment model whereby each lab PI, lab head, faculty member will select the students that will join their lab directly. And so, from the beginning, there's, some things to be worked out about how to employ best a holistic approach, like Dean Klingensmith has been outlining. And so, Dean Richter, who will be following my presentation, will be going in a little bit more in detail about the sort of nuts and bolts about how we achieve the scoring and record keeping of the rubrics in this web-based platform called Slate that we use for all of our admissions. And for us, we've sort of leaned on that heavily and utilized that platform. And so every faculty member basically will be selecting students that they will have Skype interviews and then on-site interviews using the holistic rubric, and then their scores are entered in. And another thing, sort of to follow up on what Dean Klingensmith was saying about the sort of NIH style, another thing I'd add as well is that, in an NIH style or NSF style review process, it's not like the scores are numerically averaged and ranked, and there's some degree of to make it truly holistic, of judgment by which each faculty member will assemble those 5 scores into an overall score, and that's true in NIH scoring as well. Say something like the significance or the approach tend to drive the scores. And it's sort of up to the review panel to how they sort of put it together and weight it. And that remains the same with our program as well. But could I have the next slide, please? As I was mentioning, there's some practical challenges to implementing the holistic rubric. One is that we just have, it's just the numbers. We have over 600 applications this past year. It's not uncommon for a particular faculty member to have over 100 applications that have named them as a lab they might that the applicant would like to work in, and so it becomes sort of a logistical problem of how to identify the applicants that will receive the sort of greatest attention. I mean, I don't think any individual can read in full detail 100 applications. And so to offset the sort of maybe tendency to use the most readily available numeric metrics, GPA, GRE scores, we implemented in this past year an additional layer of review where we have a committee that will scrutinize, so one member of the committee will look at every application, every single one, from the lower portion of GPAs, employ the rubric, and the goal is to identify potential outstanding future researchers. I mean, we're a top-ranked program. Our goal is to identify the very best researchers among our applicant pool to receive the greatest amount of attention, and then ultimately to be recruited into our program. And so we're looking for those outstanding researchers that, for whatever reason, may not necessarily have had the highest GPAs. And there are innumerable reasons why that could be. They may have had a difficult transition to college. There may have been health issues. There may have been family issues, economic issues. Any number of life events may have happened. And in some cases, they are outstanding researchers by other levels of success, their ability to do research during their undergraduate career, involvement in leadership activities. And it just may not be reflected by, they may not have a 3.9 or a 4.0. And so our goal is to identify those researchers and make sure that they get a close look by the faculty that they relate to. And so the committee's goal is to go in and look at every single application and then identify those that are outstanding potential researchers despite the fact, or maybe even because of the fact. Maybe that whatever led to the incident that led to the GPA that wasn't perfect brought on some amazing, the overcoming of that obstacle resulted in some amazing grit and exhibited some amazing creativity. And those are certainly aspects that we would like to, that bode well for a strong research career. And so the committee will then reach out to faculty members that are relevant and say, hey, take a closer look at this applicant. And in this past year, a number of our students were recruited through this model, through the faculty member looking directly at their application, without the committee being involved. We have a range of students that came in through these various processes, but it was implemented so that we made sure that despite our direct recruit process, we are really applying this holistic rubric. And I will say that the whole idea to do this came out of a faculty implicit bias workshop that we as the biomedical engineering faculty got together, had sort of a guided workshop on implicit bias and talked about ways that our department might be able to do better. And this is an initiative that came out of that. So, this is all work in progress. I would love to hear ideas from the rest of the group here today. This is, certainly don't think we've, perfected this, but these are things that we've been working on in the past couple of years to try to make our application process more holistic. So with that, I will turn it over to Anneli Richter.
Thank you, Joe. Like Joe said, I'm Anneli Richter. I am the Dean for Admissions at the Graduate School at Duke. In the graduate school, we work with roughly 80+ departments. 50 of those are PhD programs and the remainder are master's programs. The challenge with that is trying to implement a process for all that will fit all programs. We have not been successful with that yet. If anybody has, please let us know. But our attempt to move toward holistic admission is one way where we've been able to set up a common goal for all of us. And as both John and Joel mentioned, the USM Sloan Fellowship and BME adoption of the holistic admissions process provided us in admissions with a launch pad for extending that toward the rest of the university. And that is one of the goals of the USM actually, is to learn and then transfer those successes to other areas of the university. When COVID hit and our applicants had trouble signing up for GRE, TOEFL, all the standardized testings, we determined that GRE optional for last year, would be a way to help applicants submit applications. As both Joel and John mentioned, the GRE is one of those easy parameters to look at when you're reviewing an application. And our concern was, how do we make sure that just GPA doesn't become the target in review when the GRE may be removed. And so we required departments who wanted to go GRE optional to do holistic admission through a rubric. And we provided 4 sessions of rubric development workshops to help departments develop a rubric that would work for them. And as Joe mentioned, our slate admissions review process incorporated that holistic review. Next slide, please. What I included here were just a few of the resources that we provided to the departments. We created a box.com folder where all our relevant resources have been included, and I've highlighted the most useful ones right here. Next slide, please. As far as the sessions themselves, we introduced holistic admissions, holistic review, identifying drivers and barriers. There are great reasons to do holistic review. It is also a time-consuming process, so we wanted to say that up front. As John said, we needed to define the goals. What is success? What are we looking for? Who is involved in our review process? And what should we review based on the materials we have available? And what's the order of the review? All of these are important questions to answer before you dive into making a rubric. Part of making a rubric is determining who should be part of developing it. If you have a committee of 34 people that review applications, it's probably not productive to have all 34 involved in developing a rubric. But we might select 1 or 2 key people who then bounce the ideas and drafts off a committee. And the core of the session was focused at the development of the rubric itself. Next slide, please. So the first item is selecting application elements pertinent to the goals of each department. In general, those are the elements that John mentioned, the GRE, the academics, the recommendations, the statement of purpose, research experience, and so forth. And determining what order to review those, because order matters. You gain a first impression depending on what you look at. So important to think about how to order things. As John mentioned, what is the rating gauge you're going to use? 1 through 5, 1 through 3, 1 through 7, and determining, you know, how do you differentiate? How do you clearly define ratings with descriptions that differentiate the scores? And the ups, the positive and the negative of having a tighter range versus a broader range. These were all elements that we talked about in that session. Next slide, please. This is a picture of the review form, an image of the review form that we use in Slate to help faculty reviewers remember what the criteria are in the holistic review. So we're including academic rating, personal statement, letter of reference. You can see all of them there, as well as the overall rating that both John and Joel had mentioned earlier. The overall rating is not an average, but the overall sense of the reviewers feel for this application. And there is a rubric for that as well, but to help provide some less defined numeric value to the application. We did not define high or low because some departments have 1 as high, others have 5 as high. We left that open to the departments to define themselves. The comment box is there for the reviewers to use. All of the input that is made on this review form can be queried and exported into Excel. And we made every element on the form optional because some departments wanted to use all, others wanted to use just the overall. And as this was our introductory year a couple years ago, we didn't want to mandate, but wanted to sell the benefits. And I think it has paid off. Next slide, please. This is just an example of the the letters of reference. And for our biomedical programs out of the School of Medicine, we created together with them a rubric that actually incorporated, a rubric in Slate that incorporated the review form. So this is a piece of the review form for the School of Medicine program. And if you are a reader and you're reviewing the letter of reference, your review form looks like this. And if you choose that this person is a 2, when you click on that 2, you actually see what you're clicking on. We have this available to any department that wants to use it, but with 84 departments, we can do very little in terms of a form for every department. So if someone wishes to use one of our core rubrics, then we can build it in this manner for them. And it includes the overall holistic ratings as well. And as with the other form that you saw, everything can be queried and put into Excel. And again, all the elements of the form are optional. Next slide, please. So our progress to date, and I'm happy to go through in the question and answer and the breakout sessions more in detail what we did, but I wanted to just provide an outline there of what our sessions consisted of. We have extended the requirement now to do holistic review with a rubric beyond just the GRE optional departments. For this year, it is now all departments. At this point, we're at 48 out of 78 admitting departments have rubrics that they have submitted to the graduate school. And we have 4 more rubric development sessions scheduled for this summer and fall. And we also do individual meetings with departments who feel that their needs are very different from what we've provided as a whole. So this is where we are today with holistic admission. And I'm going to move on to the next.
All right, I will stop screen share here and move us back to our conversation. Thank you so much. That was so informative and raises lots of questions. There's several in the chat, and I urge people to put in other ones, and I will kick us off here. The first question was, do the candidates know what the rubric criteria are? And so how, does that help us? Does that help the candidates figure out how to craft their personal statements or work on their portfolios or figure out whether they're viable candidates?
For us, those rubrics are internal and confidential. It is not intended to be something that applicants should craft their responses to, but more so a way of consistent evaluation across applicants.
I mean, for our own department, we have on our website for the application page for PhDs, there's just a very brief statement of, stating that great researchers come from a variety of different experiences and backgrounds and strengths. And we don't enumerate the rubric, but there's certainly, I think, a ethos, a feel for all the ways one can be well prepared to embark on a research career in a statement form.
Thank you. And Joel, maybe sticking with you here, I think you said that the impetus for your department really came out of an implicit bias training. Can you just tell us a little bit more about, does your department do that every year? Is that a department-wide training? Is there also university-wide implicit bias training? We'd love to hear a little bit more about that and the frequency of that.
Yeah, so we started 2 years ago. So our students are we have a really, really devoted and engaged PhD student population, in part organized through our BME student, PhD Student Association, who are very involved in our recruiting of the next generation of our subsequent classes. They help program the events, the social events, the informal things that happen between interviewing with specific labs. And of course, this was all had to be done virtually in the past year. But they are very, very involved in the process. And in fact, PIs rely on students' input in assessing folks who have come in to interview. And so we started with 2 years ago having implicit bias training mandatory for our students. And then this past year, we made it mandatory for our faculty. And we will continue to do that in subsequent years. And the idea to have this committee-based holistic review of applicants that may not have made an individual's, say, triage list sort of organically came out of the discussions we had as a faculty in that implicit bias training. So I hope that answers the question.
Anneli, can you speak to, is there implicit bias training available for other departments, or how does that happen around the university?
So I believe John, help me out here. I believe we have implicit bias training for faculty, but we don't have anything at this point that is for like admissions focused. I'm actually working with our OIE, Office of Institutional Equity, to see if we can develop something for the graduate school to offer to departments. That is something we started this summer, but it is not yet a flushed out presentation or workshop, but it is in the works.
Yeah, there's lots of implicit bias programming in certain areas. For example, I think all faculty search committees now have to undergo implicit bias training as they embark on a search for a new faculty position. So there's lots of focused implicit bias training, as well as general events for different populations. For example, all incoming graduate students, as part of their responsible conduct and research training, receive training in implicit bias.
Thanks. And I guess it would be really helpful to hear a little bit more about how do these scores then get actually used in the conversations about who to admit, and how does that, tell us a little bit more, like lift the lid on like, so what happens, what happens once everyone has rated, and how many people rate each candidate? So just a little bit more about how the sausage is getting made then.
Jill, I don't know if you want to share, but I can start by giving like a 30,000 foot overview. Each department does their own process. Joel's department is very large. Other departments may receive only 30, 40, 50 applications. So the review process is very different. Some departments review applications once or twice, meaning 1 or 2 reviewers, most of the time 2 reviewers. That is what we strongly push and recommend, a minimum of 2. Some departments have 3, 4, 5, 6. And at that point, I'm actually encouraging departments to back off a little bit and instead do a more collaborative effort of review. So the number of scores that each student receives is going to differ across departments and volume of applications. What we have done from the graduate school perspective through Slate is to prepare what we call queries, basically data pulls, so that a department can pull all the individual reviewers' ratings into a spreadsheet with additional information about the candidate. We call it a slate, a query, funny, right? Slate, and we use the slate, but it is a spreadsheet basically that includes the basic biodem, the educational information, any information from the application that a department wishes to include in the spreadsheet, as well as the criteria, as well as the ratings provided by the reviewers and the reviewer names. That provides a very powerful tool for a committee review, for example, because you can decide, you know, what are you going to filter this spreadsheet on? How are you going to sort on the spreadsheet, and how many different sorts are you going to do to find the different elements that you're looking for in candidates? It becomes a way, it's also a very good way of calibrating readers because you have some readers who are consistently very lenient, very kind. We call them the doves. And then you have reviewers who are harsh and, you know, better than average is not going to happen. Those are our hawks. And you need to know who your doves and hawks are when reviewing a spreadsheet of applications. So some of our departments actually go through and in some sort of way standardize the scores, account for that differentiation. Other departments talk through and through conversation can say, okay, yeah, why are you this harsh? I think this person is better. When you have access to what everyone has done, the conversation is much easier or more intense, but at least there's a conversation. And so I think the fact that the data is available and is used is a very good step toward consistent review of applications. From my perspective, part of it also is, how do you train your reviewers? Do you ask your reviewers to look at 10 applications each and then meet up and see what you've done, right? Can you help calibrate the group so that you're thinking along the same lines when you're looking at the rubric? The rubric is helpful, but how it's interpreted by each individual reviewer also makes a difference. And the more calibrated a group can be, the more consistent review you'll have of applicants. So I hope that helps to some degree.
I would also add that from the perspective of being a reviewer, a rubric really helps because you don't have to keep rethinking about what the criteria are for each application. They're all in front of you and the scores are in front of you. So not only is it easier as you review the applications, but then when you're trying to think back, now what did I like about this guy or not like? You just go back to your completed rubric and there's your information right there.
I think the other piece is, prior to joining the graduate school, I worked at the business school at Duke, at Fuqua. And our number of applications for our daytime program was just under 4,000 applications, and they were reviewed by a small number of people. And so these trainings and rubrics were incredibly helpful. I would read hundreds of applications, didn't do much of anything else during that time. But you think you know the rubric, and you get used to, yep, this is a 3, this is a 2, this is a 1. And then when you go back and check yourself against that rubric, you go, ooh, I've kind of swerved away from it a little bit, and you can pull yourself back in. So it's the rubric that I showed, the review form that I showed that included the wording of each value in the review form is, from my perspective, very helpful as a reviewer, but because you can't but help to take a peek at what you're clicking at to remind you, is this really what I meant for this candidate on this category?
Well, everyone, welcome back. I want to just take one more minute here to thank our 3 panelists, John, Joel, and Anneli. That was a wonderful conversation. And as you can see on my screen, I hope, we have more Wheel Bazaars coming, 5 more over the course of the summer. So if you found this helpful, please join us for the others. Next week is on designing skill building and professional development courses. And the week after that will be on fostering alumni and department engagement. So 2 more topics that seem hot and interesting to people. But I just want to say thank you again to our panelists and wish you all a great week and a happy 4th of July. Thank you all so much for being here.